And I could not be more pleased at the two speakers that we have brought here today to speak. Our first speaker will be Robert V. Bullough. Bullough, Bob, earned his PhD from Ohio State University in 1976. He spent some 20 years at the University of Utah before coming to BYU in 1999, where he's now the Associate Director of the Center for the Improvement of Teacher Education and Schooling. Bob has an extremely impressive resume, very impressive record. He's the author or co-author of some 11 books and many dozens, several dozens, many times over, book chapters, articles on the subject of education. And he's not only an excellent historian of education, he's also a real philosopher of education. He's given these issues a great deal of thought, and very good thought. He is also distinguished in being the very first external fellow of our Humanities Center, an idea that our Dean, John Rosenberg, and Associate Dean Greg Clark had was to nominate somebody from around the university whose work intersects in meaningful and dynamic ways with our Humanities Center to be, for a year, an external fellow of our Humanities Center. And the person they thought about first was Bob Bullough. And I've got to say, I'm not sure they thought first about the idea of the fellowship and then thought about Bob, or thought about Bob and the fellowship. And this is because in many conversations with Bob, they've been inspired by the depth of his wisdom on these subjects. And I know Bob personally somewhat. He's a neighbor in Salt Lake City, where he's held in very high esteem, and he's a great friend. The title of his talk today is Higher Education and the Neoliberal Threat, subtitled Fast Time, Place, and Identity. Please welcome Bob Bullough.
Thank you, Matt. What Matt didn't say is I was his bishop. So I know things about this man. It's a wonderful thing to be here. I can't think of people I care more about on this campus than John Rosenberg and my dear friend Greg and Matt. It's a privilege to serve here with them. This has been a very difficult piece for me to write. I felt compelled to try to attend to BYU, and talking about your own home always is a bit of a challenge. So the paper itself is actually divided into three parts. The first part has three sections, each one providing a context for the second and third parts. These sections include a very brief introduction to, I mean very brief, to Professor Newfield's argument, which I find compelling, a sweeping overview of neoliberalism, and I mean sweeping, and a brief discussion of higher education's responses to it. Part two of the paper is also composed of three sections, each an effect of neoliberalism: loss of place, fast time, and compromised virtue. The third part offers thoughts about BYU and the College of Humanities as we move into the future. I'll be curious what you think. So part one, the argument. I urge you to read Professor Newfield's books, Ivy and Industry, and his less hopeful and more jarring Unmaking of the Public University, the 40-year assault on the middle class. Both books were written before the economic meltdown of the past few years, but the Great Recession only exacerbated the severity of the issues and trends discussed in these books. As Professor Newfield argues, the middle class in this country, what he calls the professional middle class, was created by the university. Publicly funded higher education and the middle class are inextricably linked. And so as the university goes, so goes the middle class. And ultimately, so goes democracy. The story told is a disturbing tale of how, quote, conservative elites who have been threatened by a post-war rise of the college-educated economic majority have put that majority, listen to this phrase, back into its place. Newfield writes, the American middle class is always politically sacrosanct, so downgrading it could not be announced as the goal. Nonetheless, this goal has been gradually achieved, as in part indexed by stagnating economic fortunes. A roundabout way was found to downsize the new middle class, and that was to discredit its cultural foundations, and of course that's the university. Although one might disagree with Professor Newfield's centering his argument on cultural wars, rather than the effects of economic globalism in remaking the American public university, there is no question that these wars, when coupled with the economic manifestations of globalism, have dramatically narrowed the vision, purposes, and function of public higher education. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism means many things: unbridled choice, radical deregulation, and the weakening of the welfare state, privatization, and the extension of free markets into ever wider arenas of social life. In consequence, we have witnessed aggressive and rapid shifts in wealth and its accumulation and concentration in very few hands, the wholesale movement of family-sustaining jobs to low-cost labor markets around the world, and the weakening of all things public. As events surrounding the Great Recession reveal, deregulation and privatization have rendered a body blow to the middle class and to the children of the middle class who, in having internalized the promise of America, attended or aspired to attend college. As corporate profits boomed and executive salaries of even unsuccessful companies soared, the middle class, facing stagnating or falling wages and job loss, the high point of white male wages was 1973. That was the high point, has weakened and hollowed out. The specter of hegemonic neoliberalism looms over the land, an uncritical worship of free markets as promising falsely universal prosperity, coupled with a cultivated and aggressively marketed cynicism about the ability of public institutions to efficiently serve public interests. Culture warriors, as Newfield describes them, helped make the fallout more or less palatable by championing visions of what he calls Meritocracy 1, an ideology at home in social systems characterized by severe scarcity of resources and opportunities. Meritocracy 1, Newfield writes, quote, reinstalled a conservative bedrock beneath the diversity talk, restoring test scores, rank hierarchy, the scarcity of high-quality resources, and the aura of a small elite group of talent at the top. Lacking robust institutions and social networks, as Bauman writes, Bauman is a British sociologist, very interesting man. As Bauman writes, persons are left alone to devise solutions to socially generated problems and to do it individually, using their individual skills and individually possessed assets. Such an expectation sets individuals in mutual competition and renders community solidarity downright counterproductive. As ideology, the power of neoliberalism seems boundless. Benefits are privatized, although the claim is that some few benefits trickle downward, while the negative consequences of neoliberalism are socialized, widely spread, but also privatized, disproportionately placed on the backs of our most vulnerable citizens. Whatever the outcomes, they are assumed to be inevitable. The results of the natural movement of the invisible hand of the marketplace and of persons exercising the now most fundamental of human rights, the right to choose. Eviscerated, democracy has come generally to be understood as nothing more than the right to choose between two candidates. A vibrant democracy, however, pleads a contrary view. The consumer is an enemy of the citizen. Clearly, as Bauman suggests, competitive individualism divides people rather than brings them together around common interests. Inevitability proves to be a key term, one that justifies selfishness while encouraging feelings of shame among the economically dispossessed. Inevitability also sustains a deep and widespread ethical insensitivity to the plight of others, born of presumed self-merit and deserved privilege on the one hand, and the impossibility of things being not as they are on the other. The question, am I my brother's keeper, is answered with a pause. Not really. My brother is, after all, my competitor, and there can only be winners and losers in this game. Ironically, when Adam Smith wrote about the wonders of markets, he assumed a marketplace situated within a moral order composed of people who knew something about and were sensitive to the importance of being a brother's keeper. Believing that markets would produce a liberal, quote, a liberal reward of labor, Smith was convinced they would support the well-being of families and children of the working poor, whose hard lives he found so deeply troubling. Unable to imagine how markets destroy virtue, Smith envisioned a future of material abundance shared by all, still a neoliberal promise. The irony is that while free markets have, to a degree, enriched many nations, simultaneously they have impoverished large portions of those very nations' populations, persons who form massive underclasses and have widened the gap separating the rich from everyone else, including a shrinking middle class. And there are additional ironies. As it turns out, markets are wasteful. They create needs no one needs fulfilled and fail to satisfy the genuine needs everyone has. And if this isn't strange enough, market growth depends on fulfilling needs that must remain unfulfilled, for complete satisfaction destroys markets. Ultimately, as markets play out in higher education, they waste a tremendous amount of talent. Next section, higher education responds. As state support for higher education dramatically declined and flattened, and you probably saw the budget of the governor. He was excited to give anything to higher ed. So this is a major issue for us. As state support for higher education dramatically declined and then flattened, year after year, tuition was increased. Middle-class parents and college students came to find themselves mired in deepening piles of unmanageable debt. According to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. college student loans now total nearly $1 trillion, 93% loaned by the federal government. Much of the increase in tuition offset non-instructional university costs, but not only of intercollegiate athletics. To ameliorate tuition increases, universities raised average class size and hired growing numbers of comparatively cheap itinerant faculty, now numbering 70% of all faculty. As a money-saving strategy, of course, this one, employing large numbers of part-time faculty, has its limits. At some point, changing who teaches within the university alters the nature of the educational experience of students and undermines the quality of that experience, which is essential to sustaining product competitiveness and therefore institutional viability. Representing diverse origins, these costs include ballooning administrative expenses associated with perpetual fundraising, and managing and responding to the increasingly aggressive and expensive systems of accreditation and accountability, as well as bills accrued from an unexpected source that Professor Newfield discusses, generous subsidies for the grants deemed essential to status and proving institutional worth. Research grants only rarely are self-supporting. Personal and family debt have grown as the economic rewards for college graduation have attenuated and become disproportionate, reflecting an increasingly stratified status system of higher education with growing gaps between elite, well-funded private and a few select public research universities and their return on investment, and all the other institutions. Nevertheless, parents and students expect returns on their investments, and not only in greater maturity and learning, but also in future security and employment certainty. Despite high startup costs and production costs, the university is going and has gone online in the hopes of containing costs, strengthening work education alignment, and looking ahead of making a profit. MOOCs have captured the imagination of many educators, although there are signs that enthusiasm is tempering as the difficulties of the task, likelihood of the rewards accruing to a very few select universities, and potential negative consequences for learning are recognized. A trend very far advanced in the UK and following a path opened by for-profit institutions, education is being commodified, packaged into self-contained modules, that's the term, that promise high portability and ease of consumption. One trade-off is that once set as a delivery system, modules typically remove instructor control over the curriculum, including course aims, even as instructors are often charged with maintaining student motivation for learning. A less obvious result is that the module structure and form as an independent, freestanding slice of content is more conducive to training than to education. The distinguishing characteristic of training, itself representing a service or a product, is a high degree of predictability that certain actions will lead to targeted responses, pre-specified outcomes in others, and that proof of value or achievement is direct, involving a specific demonstration, like passing a test. In contrast, education, a process, is messy, boundaries permeable, outcomes uncertain, and highly context and person sensitive. Proof of educational accomplishment is always indirect and usually long delayed. It is for this reason that Oxenham concludes, quote, "Competencies simply do not have the necessary robustness to uphold the deeper functions of higher education." As measurable, skills and competencies are given precedence over understandings, and replicative and applicative uses of knowledge are preferred to associative and interpretive uses. The former represents the sort of knowledge that dominates MOOCs, a notion of knowledge quite close to the notion of information, sets of facts, pieces of data, or concrete bits of larger processes. No surprise, nearly all MOOCs are in the sciences and mathematics, comparatively safe subjects. 2, this is part 2, place cyberspace and identity. Economic globalism, coupled with technological advance, not only has expanded markets worldwide, but also has had the effects of weakening the power of place generally, while undermining the stability and forms of relationship that sustain identity. For the work of universities, perhaps there is no more significant issues than those associated with the loss of grounding. The issue is complex. While the world has become smaller, also it has become much larger and more diverse. Globalization homogenizes human lives by imposing a set of common denominators, state organization, labor markets, consumption, and so forth. But it also leads to heterogeneation, you fill in the blank, through new forms of diversity emerging from the intensified contact. There is no guarantee that contact with strangers will be intense, engaging, or mind-expanding, however. Indeed, perhaps the most powerful response to these developments by those unable to book a tour is a growing sense of alienation. Feeling threatened and lost, identities are shored up in walled communities and by identity politics, the politics of presumptive sameness and fundamentalism. As Erickson argues, disembedding is always countered by re-embedding. The more abstract the power, the sources of personal identity, the media flows, and the commodities available in the market become, the greater will be the perceived need to strengthen and sometimes recreate or even reinvent local foundations of political action and personal identity. Markets, of course, put consumers in charge. Just as consumers may choose products wisely or unwisely, the technologies of the marketplace offer the opportunity to engage difference as well as to maintain and sustain sameness. No surprise, as Erickson observes, globalization does not create global people. As the Boston Marathon bombers illustrate, webs can support insular networks experienced as communities across thousands of miles. Identity politics and the threat of difference, sharpened by rapidly growing insecurity and economic uncertainty, are among the materials used to construct the conservative elite response to the rise of the middle class detailed by Newfield. The elements of identity politics are well known. They always entail competition over scarce resources, dominance of ascribed within group similarities over cross-group equality, invocation of historical injustices and past suffering, use of cultural myths and images to recall and strengthen shared group experiences, employment of simple contrasts to distinguish in and out group membership, and the unflattering comparisons of invaders with first-comers, the last element calling for defense of place, even if it's a ghetto. Identity politics, Erickson concludes, is a true-born child of globalization. Indeed, globalization triggers group conflict and actualizes differences while providing the opportunity to avoid serious engagement with those differences. Next section, time, hurried and harried. Time is an enacted material social practice that organizes the functions of temporality. In neoliberal advanced market economies, the scarcest resource for people on the supply side is the attention of others, time. Incessant ads and sales pitches followed by aggressive requests for feedback and product satisfaction once a purchase has been made, and communication technologies from Twitter to Facebook all push ever-growing volumes of information at us that demand attention. Press for quick responses, time speeds up. Gaps are filled so there is less and less downtime, and time becomes more dense, more hurried, but less durable. Losing duration and linearity, the sense that time goes somewhere, belief in progress is weakened, leaving behind a nagging feeling of always being behind, of reacting, but of never quite being in control of one's life. Nothing is better than having a scheduled meeting unexpectedly canceled, which opens a moment for solitude. The slow time involved in feeding or helping a child get dressed and engaging in other family activities leads to impatience. That's me. It's impossible to speed up a child. Sitting in church, congregates text one another, and addicted to speed and holding an expectation that everyone is always available, get frustrated when a return response from across the chapel or the world is delayed. While waiting, dare I say reverently, half listening to the speaker, a video game is played. Wired and plugged in, student attention spans are fleeting, having adapted to what Erickson describes as the tyranny of the moment. Students expect to be entertained by teachers who sense they are in a losing battle. Students' minds flit about and defy teachers' best attempts at netting. At home, rather than in class, young people would simply click and change the channel or fast forward. For university faculty, information overload leads to a narrowing of knowledge, as no one seems able to read broadly or deeply, and those who try spend a large portion of their time filtering the flow of materials, just trying to sort out the junk. No wonder some 90% of academic papers are never cited. Indeed, as many as 50% are never read by anyone other than the authors, referees, and journal editors. Those are real numbers. Efficiency encourages reliance on review articles, and not actually having read an article but choosing to cite it produces all sorts of mischief. Yet publication pressures grow, resulting in creation of a range of clever strategies for increasing productivity that undermine quality. As Bauerlein et al., this is a 2010 reference, state, the pace of publication accelerates, encouraging projects that don't require extensive time-consuming inquiry and evidence gathering. For example, instead of efficiently combining multiple results into one paper, professors often put all their students' names on multiple papers, each of which contains part of the findings of just one of the students. One famous physicist has some 450 articles using such a strategy. The number of publications now roughly doubles every 20 years, and journals pile up. Bauerlein et al. Offer a straightforward solution. Fewer journals, less publishing. Accelerated time affects university faculty work in additional ways. In short time, quick and increasingly trivial studies are favored over long-term projects. In reviews, recent publications are privileged over earlier publications, encouraging production of ungrounded and sometimes repetitious works, a problem that few reviewers can recognize. Lack of memory undermines cultural transmission and weakens the ability to generate explanatory narratives. Fast thinking, as Erickson suggests, is preferred to slow, reflective thought, the sort of thinking involved when pondering ideas and wrestling with vexing problems. Reflection, as Dewey argues, necessitates learning how to pause. Dangers of a rush to judgment and confirmation bias arise, suggesting strong connections between slowness and integrity. Oddly, the faster we go, the less likely it is that our actions will result in desired changes in institutional life. Systems change slower than their environment, and to take hold, changes require slow time. The result is that speed and fast thinking actually undermine efficiency. By becoming an end in itself, simply going faster is not a means to going better. Finally, fast time and fast thinking are embedded in tenure systems. Tenure may seem to involve a marathon, but given how quickly time passes, how time-intensive consequential research is, and how long it takes to get a piece into print, a sprint is an apt analogy. A sprint with often misplaced, missing, or misaligned starting blocks. To support scholarship, young faculty are given reduced teaching loads and excused from most forms of service. Decisions that distance them from the students they're to teach and from getting to know other faculty members and their work. Generally, in the area of scholarship, tenure privileges quick accumulation of capital, professional chatter over the pleasures of conversation. The press young faculty feel. Now this is an interesting point for me. The press young faculty phase is to speak before they have anything worth saying. And I think that's true. And they still speak and speak. These manifestations of the effects of the speeding up of time forced Erickson to conclude that slowness needs protection, and he's right. Traditional forms of academic work are still most valued by faculty. The image of an individual scholar pursuing his or her interests according to his or her own rhythm still remains an ideal, especially in the humanities and social sciences. Echoing Dewey, Stein also argues for the value of pausing, but offers a different reason. Pauses are valuable in that their inherent discontinuity adds multidimensionality to experience, deepens what we feel. Pauses refresh as university faculty struggle to live a temporally balanced academic life, a possibility increasingly difficult to realize. Inside and outside of the university, friendship, collegiality, loyalty, and trust in and depth of relationship, including love, are each dependent on the slowness of time. Temporal balance requires some activities that consume us in the academic world must go. Next section, capital accumulation and compromised virtue. Lacking this section, the examples I lived. So, lacking strong embeddedness in place and in persons and speeding through life profoundly shapes identity, including the identities formed by university faculty. Shoppers are fickle and consumers are not easily satisfied. Oxenham describes the challenge of identity this way, quote, "The cost of using unstable things as our building material is that our identities are just as unstable as the materials we have chosen, and not everyone is fit enough to adjust to such a quick ride. Stable identities enable consistent behavior and are a condition for moral courage. When most everyone we know is a competitor for genuinely scarce or presumably scarce goods, few can be trusted, for trust often proves to be an unwise strategy. As substitute means for achieving confidence, codes and systems are formed to make interaction predictable, but systems are very poor substitutes for trust. Role prescription is role play, and within neoliberalism, when goods are scarce and consumer is the role played, revealing one's market strategy opens the strong possibility of self-diminishment. Within markets, self-worth is strictly comparative, a matter of market share, and everyone and everything is rated and ranked. In situations of genuine and imagined scarcity, if someone wins, someone else loses. So for whatever reason, if you experience a loss of academic standing, someone will experience that as their gain. This is certainly not the way to run a university or a department serious about education. In economics, money serves as the means of reducing difference to a common comparative standard of worth. The currencies of higher education are publication and citation counts. Publication quality often is an afterthought. Determining publication quality requires slow time, scarce time, to read and to ponder, and it requires insider knowledge that itself is often rare. Counting substitutes for careful consideration, and when counted, articles are dropped into catchments. Journal tiers, proxies for quality. All across this campus, everybody talks about tiers. As the Australian Research Council found after trying and failing to establish a tiered journal ranking system, the exercise is mostly a matter of smoke and mirrors, politics and marketing. Junk shows up everywhere, and so do quality publications. How do citation indexes fare as money? Online hits are easily doped, even though journal publications count them for marketing purposes. Since as noted above, so I had a British friend who sent his graduate students to call up all his articles. And so he had this massive increase in citations. I won't tell you the institution, or in hits. And he was so pleased. Since as noted above, citations are scarce, surely they must have real value. More is better. What is your H score? The moral problems associated with citation counting are subtle and complex, going well beyond the obvious issue that beginning scholars face delayed citation but imminent tenure evaluation. Some articles are cited for terrible reasons, and works that enjoy massive citation often have rather more to do with scholarly production than scholarship itself. The multiple editions of Robert Yin's book on case study methodology, for example, have been cited over 80,000 times and growing. As currency, citations and citation indexes are the subjects of market manipulation and, as always, reflecting the Matthew effect, the rich get richer. In her discussion of complexity theory, Mitchell offers the following example of how academic riches accumulate. Quote, suppose you and Joe Scientist have independently written excellent articles about the same topic. If I happen to cite your article, but not Joe's in my latest opus, then others who read only my paper will be more likely to cite yours, usually without reading it. Other people will read their papers and also be more likely to cite you than to cite Joe. The situation of Joe gets worse and worse as your situation gets better and better, even though your paper and Joe's were both of the same quality. Preferential attachment is one mechanism for getting to what Gladwell called tipping points. Points at which some process, such as citation, spread of fads, and so on, starts increasing dramatically in a positive feedback cycle. Friends cite friends, graduate students cite mentors, and universities with lots of friends and big grant-supported graduate programs and successful branding strategies enjoy prominent place within citation indexes. Poor Joe, he's a loser. What is he to do, especially if he's untenured? First, and this is an old dog talking to a young dog, what are you to do, Joe? First, you ought to become better at self-marketing, which may be distasteful, but it's not necessarily immoral. Yet self-marketing certainly can lead to serious ethical problems. Like the exemplary physicist, the famous physicist I mentioned earlier, and his students noted above, Joe might cut a deal with other young faculty, perhaps former classmates, to collaborate, meaning, I'll put your name on my work if you'll put my name on your work, which I've seen. Joe borrows capital and cooks the books. Within his tenure file, Joe portrays his involvement with these articles as greater than it was. He might even believe what he writes. Joe might publish what one colleague some years ago described as LPUs, this was a Berkeley fellow, LPUs, least publishable units, an inflationary strategy. By splitting large studies into several small publishable bits, Joe appears wealthier than he is. A good person facing a difficult situation, Joe might also tweak what essentially is one study, change the title, and since no one reads anything, publish it twice. I've seen that. As Niebuhr reminds us, in desperate situations, good people engage in morally marginal behavior. Like many wise beginners, Joe undoubtedly will be encouraged to mine his dissertation for publications. Should he, or how should he, involve his chair in publication? In the academic marketplace, senior faculty like Joe, or like junior faculty, are concerned about capital accumulation. Capital indicates worth and standing. The press to accumulation has encouraged some chairs to take credit for student work. I recall, I've seen a lot of this. I recall, for example, a young colleague worrying over her chair's insistence on being first author on a major piece, even though she merely supported the work and did some editing. Revealing strong beliefs in trickle-down academic economics, the chair urged that being listed first was not an act of arrogation, but of generosity, a matter of increasing product value. More citations would follow, she suggested, and these would benefit her former student. Graduation often changes mentor and protege roles and relationships, heightening and exposing latent feelings of competition, and perhaps revealing feelings of mentor envy of the young. In any case, mentoring, including of junior faculty by senior faculty, requires largeness of spirit that is difficult to sustain since like one's proteges, mentors live in fast time. As noted, fast time leads to shortcuts, including abrogation of essential ethical roles and professional responsibilities. I shall mention just a single example from my world. Traditionally, education faculty have made decisions about what students should be recommended for licensure to teach. These decisions have been based on professional knowledge of faculty, experience with the students over an extended period of time and in multiple settings, and understanding of program aims. Seeking what some believe to be better warrants of teacher education student quality, 23 states joined with Stanford University to develop a common portfolio-based assessment system called the EdTPA. Do you know about this, Chris? For beginning teachers. Once developed, Stanford sold the rights to Pearson Education. You're supposed to boo. A massive corporation located in London that employs over 40,000 people worldwide. Pearson, which offers a range of supporting services and products for sale, including its own e-portfolio system, will charge teacher candidates for assessment of their portfolios. In addition, Pearson also administers the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards Assessment, despite development with public funding from the U.S. Department of Education. National board candidates pay an assessment fee of $2,500, including a non-refundable fee of $500. Owning these licenses, good academic capitalist that it is, Stanford is positioned to receive tens of millions of dollars in fees. More to the point, faculty across the United States who participate in this system will no longer make determinative assessments of their students' ability to teach. That's serious. Pearson employees, paid consultants, I'm sure they're well paid, will make these decisions. Obviously, the effects of these actions are far-reaching and ethically troubling. Then there's a section on the effects of this on teaching. Part 3, looking ahead. This gets to the BYU stuff. I admit, I fear for the future of higher education. Fume over the excesses of academic capitalism and the nonsense that flows from unlimited faith in markets over the value of deliberation in forming judgments, and get upset by books that offer solutions for higher education like the almost reasonable innovative university that seems quite at peace with a world where there is one education for elite, or soon to become elite, and another for all the rest of us. But I also believe there is much right with higher education in America. I believe it is possible to have both great access and high quality. There is no doubt that Professor Newfield is correct. Democracy requires a robust middle class, and a robust middle class requires a healthy system of higher education. And a healthy system of higher education requires more and more steady state funding. I should mention, Matt commented on this. I actually grew up on the campus at the University of Utah. My dad was a faculty member there. So I was a kid running around that campus. I loved that place. One of the reasons why I left is because it was so badly beaten up. It was so difficult to do our work because of lack of support. And I loved the place. I hasten to add that the health of our nation also depends on a healthy K-12 education system, even as most economic benefits are indirect, and like education itself, a matter of developing talent in its many forms. Like Professor Newfield, I think, quote, the university needs to be understood as engaged in forms of individual and collective development that cannot be captured in economic terms. Education cannot pay in this way. Now, BYU is doing many things right, beginning with a clear set of aims. A BYU, you all know these. A BYU education is to be spiritually strengthening, character building, intellectually enlarging, and lead one to lifelong learning and service. I find that inspiring. These are aims that speak directly to Professor Newfield's concern that universities have lost sight of the responsibility to cultivate student self-development. Here, Woodruff helpfully reminds us that virtue has its greatest lasting power in close-knit communities. To establish and maintain a vibrant sense of place with embeddedness needed to support the development of virtue, and to nurture slow time, the university sponsors weekly forums or devotionals. The first time I taught a class here, and we opened the class with prayer, I was stunned. And that was the stunning experience for me. Shifted my world pretty dramatically. Stop and think about the differences in your classes here and other places. The focus on a set of values. So let me read that again. To establish and maintain a vibrant sense of place with embeddedness needed to support the development of virtue. To nurture slow time, the university sponsors weekly forums or devotionals. About half the student body is employed by the university. Now this is rare, but it's very consequential. About half the student body is employed by the university, and through this service, my wife tells me, since she was one of these students some years ago, many students become friends by working closely together, tending the campus, and make portions of it their own. She was at the old main hall, and she has stories about that building. She loves that building, the library. Year after year, the Museum of Art brings to campus exhibits that transform galleries into sacred spaces, places where one meets Karl Bloch's Christ or the Essenes' Isaiah. Truth, as we all know, be it the ancient truth of being or the Christian truth of the living God, can reveal itself only in complete human stillness. Classrooms are used as chapels, more slow time. Students engage in institutionally supported service learning and reside in dorms that require not just conformity to, but active support of the university's honor code. A code that includes clear expectations of the faculty beyond academic competence. These expectations communicate an important insight about what makes a teacher effective. To be a good teacher, one must first of all be a good human being. That's a 1942 quote, two of my heroes. Such people know that the best and perhaps only remedy for unpredictability, for the chaotic uncertainty of the future, is contained in the disposition to make and keep promises. And it is for this reason that Bauman argues that our times desperately call for reliable orientation points and trustworthy guides. We're supposed to be those people. Teaching presumably comes first at BYU, yet scholarship, as it informs and strengthens teaching, is highly valued. Grants are valued, especially when they support the aims and mission of the university. Relatedly, the sort of small grants that often make the difference in whether or not an interesting and important line of research may be pursued by a faculty member are abundant and supported by internal university funding. BYU does not suffer from dramatic swings in funding, a reflection of the steadiness of the commitment of the Board of Trustees and the sponsoring church. Memory, which necessitates familiarity with the great orienting narratives of humankind and moral sense, are cultivated in many ways, not the least of which is maintenance of a vibrant general education program on campus and consistent teaching of religious narratives. Moral matters find place in the very large student mentoring program BYU operates that brings faculty and students together in ways that strengthen relationships, encourage craft learning, and generate opportunities to grapple with the ethics of research. Collaboration with peers and with students is strongly encouraged, much more than in my former experience. For some, no doubt, this experience becomes an occasion for strengthening and enriching moral sense. Drawing on Levinas, the face-to-face relationships of mentoring, the embeddedness of two persons in a shared relationship offers a space within which morality matters. But even with these and other positive responses to neoliberalism, danger is afoot. Although ours is a private institution, we operate within a national and international higher education marketplace and political context that press the values of neoliberalism as common sense and invite us to compare ourselves to other institutions to determine institutional worth. At times, it seems we are too easily flattered by the praise that gushes from well-placed persons from being found not just like, but a little better than other institutions. Rather than feeling pride during such moments, embarrassment might be a more appropriate response. The danger of emulation is mission creep, of losing our way. Here I am reminded of a comment and a warning offered by John Goodlad. Quote, "In the early stages of redesigning settings or creating new ones, it is not wise to go forth seeking models elsewhere." Close quote. Generally, it's best to turn inward, find one's own institutional strengths and build on them. Here, a few additional words about tenure are required. Despite so few faculty enjoying the privilege, tenure systems are embedded in the national higher education marketplace. On the surface, tenure seems to promise an opportunity to resist neoliberal threats. But as currently constituted, and as noted, tenure embraces fast time, while encouraging forms of self-marketing and shameless self-promotion that weaken sense of place and undermine loyalty. Clarity and consistency of institutional vision is the best defense against neoliberalism. Accordingly, a reconstituted tenure system might support support different masters. I came to BYU from many years of service within a Research One institution, where tenure included ongoing and systematic performance evaluation and formal tenure review by colleagues across one's career. Tenure was conditional. In that institution, the game was clear and simple: publish or perish. Many faculty perished, most deservedly. I helped fire a bunch of them. Their tenure did not involve a one-sided institutional commitment to support a faculty member forever. Rather, the intent was to create a relationship of mutual expectation and accountability, albeit with minimal support and in fast time. Driven by slow time values, coupled with generous support, like that offered by the Faculty Center here, and full recognition that the development of expertise takes time and that you can't speed up maturity, frequent reviews across one's career might do wonders for scholarly production and the quality of research done at BYU. Rather than publish or perish, BYU standards should give priority to faculty growth and improvement, evidence of the quality and consequentiality of scholarship, strength of the connections between teaching and research. How can you honor and take teaching seriously if that isn't a centerpiece of our research? Very strange. And honor faculty members' service in behalf of programs and communities of inquiry. People who build the community ought to be celebrated. Although I do not believe every faculty member ought to expect a full professorship, I do believe that evidence of consistent productivity and of growing maturity of vision and understanding are reasonable expectations for someone claiming the right to profess. The current form of tenure inevitably encourages some BYU faculty, often those most successful within fast time and most invested in star systems, to actively court neoliberal seduction. A few because of ambition to move elsewhere and up, others seeking distinction within their particular fields and standing with their friends, and others still who believe, and sometimes for good reason, that the university is really more serious about things other than education. Confusion and lack of clarity about institutional expectations encourage these situations. Relatedly, some faculty sense strong institutional preferences for quantitative over qualitative research, which makes it a difficult thing for humanities colleges, and report uncertainty about what counts as scholarship, most especially those concerned most about the scholarship of teaching. Ironically, local qualitative studies are most likely to be those that support institutional values by strengthening programs and teaching. Almost done. Thomas Jefferson supposedly said that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So it is. Some years ago, the philosopher Maxine Greene made the parallel point that a morally meaningful life requires wide awakeness, which sets for educators the terrible task of actually making things harder for people by awakening them to their freedom. Disembeddedness, lack of place and memory then sustains disorientation, lack of conviction, and an inability to make strong evaluations are dressed up as urbane and principled openness. The frenzy of fast time invites indifference, blindness to moral blindness. Disconnected and rushing about, taking care of business, it is easy for university faculty to miss that the commons that make the university are emptying out and are in danger of enclosure. As faculty take care of themselves and their own programs, like hobbits tending their gardens, it's easy to miss the growing shadow of Mordor. As faculty and citizens, we have stewardship responsibilities for the university and for what is a troubled democracy. Among our obligations is to attend carefully to the well-being of BYU and our colleagues. Working within universities is a remarkable privilege, not a job, but a vocation, a calling, a gift. How is it that we here today, some of us, among billions of people on this earth, are paid to read and to inquire? That blows my mind. What could we possibly have done to be deserving of such a gift? Universities are morally loaded spaces, literally set apart for the purpose of bringing people together to meet, engage, read and write, interact and transact, argue and celebrate, and thereby learn who they are, where they fit into the scheme of things, what they want to become, and how they might better live together with and across their differences and across time. All this seems selfish until we recall that we live to serve, and only in service can we transcend ourselves and become better than we are. As commons, universities are sacred spaces where understanding of neighborliness and of what our neighbors need to thrive are broadened, and where opportunities to learn and practice an aggressive civility are abundant. Democracy, of course, as Dewey argued, is impossible without civility. It is our responsibility to care for the commons, and this means becoming more wide awake and more vigilant and responsive to the threats of enclosure. It is here where the humanities have a special institutional role and educational responsibilities, offering spaces for criticism. Vigorous criticism of neoliberalism must hold central place within these spaces. Through eminent critique, seductive, demeaning, humanly contorting, and soul-crushing manifestations of that ideology need identification and explication through study and story as they play out in the wider society. False consciousness, and within the university and the lives we and our students live within it. Eminent critique is a means for restoring actuality to false appearance, by first expressing what a social totality holds itself to be, and then confronting it with what it is in fact becoming. What is it that we're becoming? Critique begins with a destructive moment of interrogation followed by a constructive moment of loving action, a call to repentance, to sacrifice, and to service, and a reminder of our deepest human longings for connectedness and for mercy, especially for mercy. We ask, what sort of people are we, and what sort of people ought we to become? We're not fated. Neoliberalism is not natural. A question like this invites moral deliberation and points to matters of conscience and its cultivation. As Tom Green argues, conscience speaks with many voices, each requiring support of the university community and experience to flourish. The voice of craft, memory, tradition, membership, duty, service. Universities are in the business of helping make people, and the people we help make and the people we must be are people of robust conscience who know themselves and their neighbors well. Marching to a different moral drummer, especially given the power of academic capitalism with its celebration of ratings and rankings, and of the sameness valued by accreditation standards for higher education, is no mean task, but I still believe it's possible. Thank you.
Great.
Did it work?
We're going to do our
Excellent.
second speaker right now, the question and answer session after. And our second speaker, it's a real pleasure to have him here. This is Christopher Newfield, who is Professor of Literature and American Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Let me give a quick blurb here on Professor Newfield, and then we'll get to his talk. He's got a PowerPoint that I set up too, so we can. Want to do that while we'll get to that in a second. All right. Again, he's Professor of Literature and American Studies at UCSB. His main current areas of research are innovation theory, hence his presence here, and critical university studies, a field he helped found. His books include the book Mapping Multiculturalism, The Emerson Effect, subtitled Individualism and Submission in America, Ivy and Industry, Business in the Making of the American University, 1880-1980. That's at Duke University Press, 2003. And then Unmaking the Public University, The 40-Year Assault on the Middle Class. It's Harvard, 2008. His writing also covers American political psychology, race relations, science studies, future of solar energy. I think it's kind of cool. It's unlike, one of these like the others, right? But that's a cool topic, actually. Humanities-based approaches to economics, which is very, very well, by the way. He teaches courses on detective fiction, which I love, California Noir, innovation studies, critical theory, future of higher education, English majoring after college, among others. And he blogs on higher education, funding and policy at the blog Remaking the University, which we discussed in our Humanities Center a few weeks back. And also the Huffington Post, Chronicle of Higher Education. And he's currently completing a book called Lowered Education, What to Do About Our Downsized Future. Now, I've got to say, I met Chris at the Conference for the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes last year. And this brings together Humanities Center directors from all over the world. And they choose their guests there pretty carefully. And they chose Chris knowing what they were going to get was a really good assessment on the state of higher education. And Chris gave an outstanding presentation. And right then I knew if we could possibly get him here, it'd be a real coup for us. He's quite a hot property on the speaker circuit. In fact, he's here at all is very gracious. He's in Texas next week. He's bouncing back and forth across multiple states. Not much fun for traveling, but it's great to have him here. His talk is entitled Humanities and Innovation in the 21st Century University. Please welcome with me Christopher Newfield.
Thanks. That's pretty nice. Thanks, Matt. That was a great introduction. I really appreciate that. I'll try not to disprove that last part, especially being a good speaker. Really, what I'm tempted to do is just lead a discussion about Bob's excellent paper. There's all sorts of things I hope we get a chance to talk about afterwards, particularly the inspirational ending, because I completely agree that that's pretty much where we need to go. A couple of things I would just pull out in the beginning. You did a lovely job of showing the university, their higher education as a practice caught in this web of commercial practices that are tied to extremely powerful interests. So it's a daunting challenge to imagine how to pull, for example, teacher assessment out of this Pearson system that you described very briefly. And the other thing that I think is especially important is, among many things actually, is what you said about individual institutions honoring and developing local practices that are distinctive to them and that come out of their own traditions and values and communities. That really does seem to have eroded in this kind of mutual imitation of essentially Harvard. And I think it's pernicious in countries that are developing their own higher education systems to always be looking away. And I went to Singapore this summer and was relieved to see that actually that's not happening so much anymore, that in Asia there's much more interest in local practices, and I'm really pleased to hear that that's been happening here at Brigham Young and that you're part of that process, so thank you. I have some PowerPoints here that are not up there because this is disconnected. Okay, so the technical problem has just been solved. I'm putting these up here as partly as a, and I like to talk better than read out loud. And it's also there to signal that, I mean, this is kind of potentially interactive. If you see something up there that you would like me to explain or go into further or skip, et cetera, I'm really happy to do that. Let's see if this jogs it if we do that. All right, so this is quite interruptible. There we go. Okay. Sorry?
I was joking, disruptive innovation.
This grows out of an interest, as you heard Bob discuss, in saving public universities, which I do think are sort of the foundation of democracy, multiracial democracy in particular, inclusion of kinds that is both ethical. I mean, I don't think we have ethical societies without a certain amount of equality and interactivity, and the possibility of people to feel like they can be creative because of a context in which they are sufficiently equal with the people that they are working with to express themselves candidly and to think imaginatively. And that's become increasingly rare in our political space. So I've been clinging, like a lot of people, to the university as a place where that has remained possible. But something that I began to notice when I was working more with scientists and engineers in the mid-2000s in something that I was a co-founder of called the Center for Nanotechnology and Society, is the extent to which you could attract attention if you seemed innovative, and you would repel attention if you did not. So innovation became a word for kind of distinguishing between the sheep and the goats within a university community. And it was, as I thought about it more, I realized that it's actually connected to a trend in the media and political worlds that I associate with Thomas Friedman at the New York Times, who wrote a book called The Lexus and the Olive Tree, which was a massive international bestseller. I believe was published around '97, something like that, which argued essentially that the future is the Lexus and the olive tree around which communities form in relation to their beliefs and local practices is the past. So I think that's completely wrong. I also was clear from the beginning that it discriminates against the humanities and the social sciences because we are fairly easily stigmatized as attached to tradition and older ways rather than as looking towards the future and inventing the future along with everybody else in the society, including scientists and engineers. So that was partly the motivation behind the solar energy material, because it's really a project about innovation theory, but it's also been part of a project that I'm interested in bringing the saints and sinners together, scientists and humanists, and getting humanists, including myself, to think more clearly about what our contribution is to both critiquing innovation discourse as it currently is structured and in showing a way towards something better. In other words, not just criticizing, but also saying, well, here's also my better idea. So that's where this originated for me. It's also motivated by my concern about the millennial generation who is interested in entering so-called creative industries. It's more of a British term. But it's, I as an English professor, at UC Santa Barbara, teach probably 450 students a year. I get to know maybe 10% of those well. And I would say 60 to 80% of the ones that I learn to know well are interested in going into publishing, in education, into Hollywood or new media in some way. They want to provide content. They want to be creative and do creative things. They want to live in and also help expand an imaginative world that is more humane and more interesting than the ones that many of us are born into. And yet they have an extremely difficult time imagining how they're going to be able to support themselves. So a book among many that millennials or sort of late X or Gen Y people have started to write includes a book by a guy named Daniel Brooke called The Trap. And what he does is he follows some people more or less of his generation, he's probably about 30 now, who figured out different strategies of supporting creative activity or socially developmental activity. And the two people that he looked at are Pam and Claire. And Pam worked for Billionaires for Bush, which was a street performance group that showed up at demonstrations all over the United States, all through the George W. Bush presidency. And she also works at the same time as a publicist for a major bank. And then Claire works full-time on an NGO that I think is responsive mostly to sexual trauma, and doesn't have another job. And what has essentially happened is that they've produced two different pretty common pathways, neither of which is actually sustainable. One being kind of earning a comfortable living, selling out, and feeling like your personal creative work is just a sidelight that you do when you have time. And the other, the creative or the contributory to a community work that in fact is driving you further and further into debt and poverty, and which you will have to leave at, say, age 29 or 34, when you just can't hang on anymore and you need to actually make a living. So I think it's a fairly common situation, and then it was worsened after this and other similar books came out by the crisis that began in 2008. And so I won't read through these, but I'm just going to put these numbers up. There are basically 100% of the interesting industries that my students, and I'm sure many of yours would like to enter, lost somewhere between 20, 30, 50% of their jobs in the 5 years of the crisis that may or may not be over as we sit here. Some of them involving music, some of them involving architecture. Many of them as being kind of second-tier services that seem practical, that seem to be honoring technical skills, but which in fact are as vulnerable economically and as fragile in terms of offering a settled, stable career which will allow you to settle down in the traditional sense of that, as being a musician or being an actor. So in other words, the really risky jobs are really risky, but then the jobs that seemed like they were going to be more stable and that seemed like a compromise that you could convince your parents would justify them paying for college have turned out to be similarly fragile. One of the ones that I find most traumatic as a huge theater hound and opera lover is that in the possibly 1.5 cities in the United States that is capable of sustaining professional musicians or musicians, classical musicians, as a profession over a lifetime, that takes you 15 years to start to do properly, and then another 30 to become really great at, they lost half their members in the same period. So it's, it's horrible. I don't know if any of you heard this phrase, Planet 22, 22, 22 basically stands for being 22 years old, making $22,000 and working 22 hours a day as, sort of the new norm. And there are lots of examples of unpaid internships or low paid internships where you're expected to work 65 hours a week and where you can be basically fired at will for simply not being slavish enough. So essentially, one of the things that's been happening for the students that wind up in the humanities and the qualitative social sciences is that yesterday's bad jobs turn out to be their good jobs. They're jobs that allow them to be creative, or at least to have the hope that they can step into that position in the near future, the imaginable future, that we've produced new levels of white-collar exploitation in creative industries rather than creative industries being the place where you try to keep that out. So, Bob talked about the adjuncting crisis in academic labor, which is widespread and widely known. When did it become okay for universities, these pillars of enlightenment, to have some of the most exploitative working conditions in the United States rather than the least? And the same can be said of many of these other industries, whether it's a photography studio or even companies that have, good margins, but that are nonetheless, building up cash with cash reserves for rainy days that they imagine are going to happen in the next few weeks because of the instability of their own larger industries. So there's all sorts of problems with this. And then the thing that I'm going to be talking about a little bit more is, and this is connected to what Bob said earlier about globalization, is that we're getting very highly skilled people into low pay positions rather than high pay positions, where the one thing that's remaining from the old thing that you used to think you would get if you got high level skills is high stress. you don't get the high pay, you do get the high stress, and you don't get the high stability that one had assumed one would get as a result of a long arc of education and then apprenticeship. Okay, so it just as a visual representation of what we're getting coming out of universities, we have qualitatively oriented students who are great at hermeneutics and interpretation, and the thinking about relationships, psychological subtleties, linking social forces and the inner life together, complicated and difficult and ambiguous practices of information and knowledge creation. And they end up in nonprofits, in social organizations or NGOs, in the arts workplace, and that puts them directly, do not pass go directly to being in the bottom 50% of the wage ladder and be precarious, and in some cases, for the first few years, be unpaid and carried by your friends and family. Okay, and then we have, on top of that, we have the quants, the people that are good at this other thing, at quantitative analytics of various kinds. And they at least have a chance of getting into the corporate or the technology workplace, and they have at least a chance of getting into the top 10% or the top 1%, which is really the area in the American economy that has the characteristics of what we used to associate with the broad middle class. All right, so I think this stratification is a kind of a social crisis. It's certainly a generational crisis for millennials, and it also poses the problem of what the heck we are doing in the humanities, one that is often thrust upon us by a skeptical media, by doubting politicians, and in many cases by our own colleagues, families, and friends. All right, so there's a lot of text here, but I'm going to go, we don't have to read all of it. It just is to pose the question of why this is the case. Why do we have what quants up here and quals down here? Why this stratification? Does it only have to do with sort of the pragmatics of the way that businesses work, or is there something deeper and more cultural that we also need to think about? There are interesting sort of culture-based explanations, like most people think of artists as sort of working class, or they see them as following a vocation and being paid in basically in pride and in independence and not really needing a wage. People often thought of teaching as that kind of a profession as well. There are also is a kind of a status issue, even though artists have to be their own managers, and in fact, entrepreneurial in hustling for jobs and hustling for connections. Because of the absence of a corporate structure, they're often thought to actually not have, to be entrepreneurial, to instead be on the sort of the receiving end of largesse coming from society. And then there's all sorts of stereotypes about, art is what children do, art is what retired people do, art is a pastime, it's a leisure activity, it's a fun thing that has really nothing to do with actual work. So here's a sort of a summary of some of these trends that I'll just put in front of you as really as something to have in the back of your mind as we go on to think more about where the humanities can connect up with an innovation discourse that people take seriously. And so far what we're seeing is that the humanities has an innovation discourse that nobody thinks is serious and that they also don't see as particularly innovative. One general reason is something that Bob talked about, this term neoliberal, that the American macro culture we say informally, in our genes, to be market-oriented, to be skeptical about intellectual things that don't seem to pay in a direct way, skeptical of things that are not sufficiently commercial. And there's also this kind of Puritan base in which, it really goes back to Plato, but it's also a kind of a strain in American Protestantism, in which artists who are not turning their hand directly to the reproduction of the society through family and through work are idle in a deep sense and must suffer, or can be allowed to suffer. And then there's something else that I talked a lot about in that book, which I think is an ongoing issue, and that is that the American right has been fighting basically 100 years war around culture, and it has won. It's fundamentally victorious in terms of the political world framings of issues. And one that George Lakoff talks about has to do with the strong father versus the nurturing father. And the strong father is, is sort of the default mode, and the nurturing father is the one that comes in when you don't need to circle the wagon, feed the kids, make sure the country is strong, get the economy back on its feet, et cetera. It's basically 100% of the general challenges that we see as a society in front of us have the strong father as the lead figure and the nurturing father as recessive and optional, and in the universities, with the children, but not out in front, taking care of business. And then there's also this question of democracy. We see ourselves as the leading, really, democratic nation and a beacon of inspiration around the concept of democracy in the world. My feeling, having lived in and studied American culture for longer than I care to contemplate, is that we actually, as a society, don't believe in democracy as efficient or as ethical. That is, that democracy allows unethical behavior to dominate, the good drives out the bad, and that we need a kind of constitutionally moral values to control it. And that also, if you look at our business system, or if you look at our universities, we don't believe that self-organized democratic practice is effective in managing systems, and we move it to auditoriums and to committees rather than allowing it any kind of direct power over budgeting or over capital projects, or even finally over the approval of the overall curriculum. So I think that these are all things that militate against the arts and humanities having a central and a prominent place, and they're kind of cultural biases that we're familiar with. But the question that I also bring to this is, can we really stop and say, that the situation is hopeless in getting arts and humanities into a central or a leadership role, and that we just have to be content with our niche? And the answer to this is no, we can't stop here, partly because that outcome is unacceptable, at least to me. That is the secondary recessive position, but also because I don't think that this is really the whole story. And I would use science as an example, actually. They have interestingly, all the same problems. They don't really work either. They are, if you do polling, they are at least as politically left as humanities folks. The academic discipline that was the most completely opposed to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 were engineers, not English professors. They're really hard. They're less popular than we are. In reality, they don't make money the way that the public often thinks. They actually lose money also. But it doesn't really hurt them in the same way. They're struggling now on the national level for various reasons. But they're definitely not in a secondary position in terms of the academic hierarchy, or in terms of what expertise is that the society looks to solve its basic problems. So I think there's a deeper issue that we have to think about, and here's where we get a bit into economic issues, and there's only going to be 2 charts like this. I want to reassure you in the beginning. And that is that we had a deal, and the deal is off. And the deal is shown by this chart called the Mischel wedge, after the economist that developed it. And what it shows you is that for the 30 years that were also great years for the public university, from 45 to 75, more or less, if you went to school, invested in your education, increased your productivity, you would also increase your wage. So down here, as your productivity goes up individually and as the society's overall productivity goes up, compensation tracks with it. And that basically just stopped. There are complicated political and other reasons for this, but it can be seen on a simplified statistical level is that although we continue to invest as a population, we continue to go to school, we continue to go to college, we continue to increase our productivity and our creativity and our creative capabilities and our talents of every kind, we continue to increase our contribution to society, we do not continue to increase our wages. There is one group for which this is not true, this loss of the upward ramp, and that is the top 10%. They, in fact, have continued. So the game now in going to college is not to go to college so you can join the middle class, but go to college so you can escape the middle class, get into the upper middle class or into the 1%, because that is the only place where over a period of decades your productivity will be fairly rewarded with proportional compensation gains. Okay, so I mean crude about what college is about, but just in terms of the economic argument for college, the argument became very fragile in the mid-70s, and it's basically never recovered. Okay, so this is part of the problem. There's a destroyed productivity bargain where if you went to college, you would be rewarded for it, all sorts of spiritual and intellectual ways, but also materially. And then there's the second issue, which is that it's policy-driven. It's globalization, but I would add a sentence to that word, which is, or a half sentence, globalization as interpreted by American policymakers. Because what you see here is that all these other wealthy countries, Denmark, France, the United Kingdom, I had Singapore there in one version of it, Japan, they decreased inequality. This is showing you is the percent of national wealth that is owned by the top 1%. And what happened is after World War II, or after the Depression, societies became much more equal. That is, the very top had a much smaller percentage of total wealth. So the 1% only had 6% in Japan, say in 1945. And then what you also see is that the majority of these wealthy societies stayed relatively egalitarian. That is, they did not respond to whatever you want to call it, post-Fordist capitalism or the rise of neoliberal capitalism after the mid-1970s by drastically increasing the inequality of their societies. Only 2 countries did that. And one of them is the United Kingdom, turquoise, and the other, the big champion in the lime green, is the United States. Okay, so there's something specifically about what the French call Anglo-Saxon business culture, political culture, and then something exceptionally unusual about the United States that has produced the situation that we are now in which being middle class is a recipe for decline rather than rise, which is what we had expected before. Okay, so we have these issues that we've already looked at, and then we also have, this is really the way that I would bring together this question of why are the millennials unable to get creative industry jobs in the arts, but they can get them in engineering, and this economic issue. And that is that basically post-middle class economics or neoliberal economics, late capitalism, there's lots of phrases for this stage that we've been in basically since the mid-1970s, that hits non-corporate sectors first. That is, that a highly organized corporate part of the economy has been able to protect itself from what has been happening in the larger economy. And so it's almost an arbitrary distinction is what I'm saying, that STEM graduates in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics have an easier time getting into those areas than do arts and humanities graduates. And the reason for that is that it's pretty simple. There are many, but the simplest one is just they have skills that go directly to bottom line issues, and arts and humanities skills tend to be more indirect and more mediated. Okay, so I do think that we now have sort of 3 factors, and this is the third, the economic one. And then the fourth, and this is the one that I'm going to talk about in the time that I have remaining, is I'm going to call the culture of the knowledge economy, which I think is a biased and narrow culture that I personally associate with Silicon Valley, but which takes many forms. And I summarize this doctrine as technogenesis. I don't know where I got this word exactly, but in other words, where genesis in the sense of an originary power to create new life in the economy, new economic life, comes almost exclusively from technology, not from capital in the traditional sense, really. It has to be capital married to labor, and not from, or, to technology, and not from labor. So the traditional elements of say capitalism as analyzed by Marx and many other people are in this scheme more or less set aside in favor of technology itself as the primary driver. And here, if you can see actually to the bottom of the slide, you can see the pretty obvious implication for us, which is that science wins, and it's, you know, people who don't do science in this economy and in this world simply can't. You drop out of, you're not in science fields because you basically flunked OChem and were forced to go into English or art history. And the reason for this is, you know, in this scheme is that, well, because science makes money, and also science is creative in the sense that it makes something real and something valuable. What the arts make in this concept is secondary. It's not even sub-creation, right, in Tolkien's sense. It's sort of below that. Okay, so what we have here, can anyone actually read this? Is those four things that I just listed are actually work as kind of a cycle. We have neoliberal materialism, we have weak democracy, we have what one set of authors have called the global auction, in which you have high skills, but it gets you low wages because you're in competition with really high-skilled people in India and in Taiwan and other places that are willing to work for a lot less. And then we have this techno-biased knowledge in the knowledge economy. And we have subordinated arts and humanities, in which all of the activities and the practices that involve, I don't know, community and relationships and the human, and I'm going to say a bit more about this in a second, that Bob was talking about at the end of his lecture, are subordinated to the other activities in this system. So the point of putting it in this loop is simply to say that they reinforce each other, that the more desperate you get to get into a job that still has a high wage, the more you buy into STEM dominance, the more subordinated art and humanities become, and so on. Okay, so this is kind of a doom loop that I think we have the potential of getting stuck in for a while, but which I'm going to argue is something that we can actually get out of. So far, so good? Any questions on this? Is this clear enough for the second half? Yes? Okay. All right, so here's the the fix, and it basically has two parts. And the first is to critique this innovation theory from the point of view of the humanities. And I'm going to give you a crude version of that in a minute. It's going to involve Schumpeter. It's going to involve a guy named Thomas Stewart, and it's going to involve a guy named Clayton Christensen. And then, so that's basically exposing the problems. And the second thing is redefining the deep needs of society beyond technology innovation. This is where the humanities become co-equal partners in imagining what the next economy, a sustainable economy, would actually look like, along with the economists and technologists and so on, and the other people that dominate the conversation right now. So it's, I think of this as kind of a neo-humanism of Massbildung, that is of individual development turned into a large-scale and basically egalitarian social practice. And I think that's more or less where we have to go, as I'll say at the end. Okay, on this first question, what we have is essentially an alliance between guys like this, between celebrity artists turned do-gooders. This is Bono of U2, and then Bill Gates in one of, I think, the most admiring expression I've ever seen on his face. Wearing one of his nicer tweed jackets, which doesn't come out very well. And it's, these are just like billionaires, technologists, and rock stars. They're all the same thing, and they're the people that create the world, the way that I was just talking about before. But this guy is named Joseph Schumpeter, interestingly wearing the same jacket that Bill Gates is, only 40 years earlier. And he's the economist that came up with the innovation model that is absolutely dominant in the United States. The term that you've heard, this term, creative destruction, I imagine. And it was actually a breathtaking insight given the inability of neoclassical economics at the time that he's writing, sort of the first and the second thirds of the 20th century, to think about invention as a central driver, as capital and labor. And so the basic point that he made was that the drive to offer new products and new methods, this endless creativity, incessantly revolutionizes the economic structure from within, incessantly destroying the old one. So it's essentially a blanket justification for damage of every kind that liberals and city planners and so on complain about, but that the vital forces in the society must, if they are to be true to the spirit of capitalism, run roughshod over, right? You cannot, if you're a life-giving capitalist in this innovation model, pause to respect the olive tree people who will always be holding you back. Okay, so Tom Friedman is essentially channeling this concept, and he's referred to at least the phrase, if not the passage, dozens of times. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put a whole bunch of text up, and it's really annoying, but it's essentially to put all of Joseph Schumpeter's thought on one slide, which is something that I love to do in my teaching in general. And there's this older model of capitalism that's investment and jobs as part of it, prosperity and concentrated wealth, leading to more capital, has something that's missing that Schumpeter puts in it, which is technology. And then there are a whole bunch of what I consider to be just myopic cultural biases, prejudices, bigotries that get imported into Schumpeter's understanding of how capitalism works. They have deep cultural roots. They are cultural ideas. They're not really economic ones, but they have gotten fused with the economic ideas in the transmission of the concept. So one of these is that the technological innovation comes from the individual entrepreneur and not from the owners or labor or government or the skill of workers or from collaboration. So Schumpeter disliked corporations as much as he liked laborers, workers. He thought that actually socialism was going to be ushered in by, Bayer Corporation, because they just had armies of bureaucrats that were destroying the vital forces. He was not a fan of corporate capitalism in that sense. But the thing that I would point to here, it's clearer in the next one, or next couple of ones, is that collaboration is also something that can hold, it absolutely does hold back the individual entrepreneur, so that social relations in which all of us are embedded are anti-innovation. That means that, this is a problem for universities, which is, shows up here. Governance, in the sense of self-governance or self-rule, the collaboration of people sitting down and deciding what their plan is anti-entrepreneurial, because the entrepreneur is always sort of an outsider and ahead of the people who are trying to make it nice for everybody. So the people who are trying to make it nice for everybody have to be seen by economists and by entrepreneurs as problems and as obstacles. We're getting through to, I think, a fairly simple explanation for why Silicon Valley moguls are so often libertarians. They're kind of liberal around social issues like gay marriage. They're adamantly opposed to, say, paying taxes that support the public community colleges and state colleges right down the road from their world-striding businesses, because they basically don't believe that all of the people that come out of mass higher education really add value. The person that made Apple value was Steve Jobs and maybe Johnny Ive, his lead designer, and a few other people. It's not all the brilliant engineers that came out of Danza College and San Jose State and Berkeley, et cetera, that wrote the code and did all that stuff. It's really Jobs. It's really Bill Gates, and it's really Bono, even though people who follow music think that Bono is an absolute atrocity on the skill level. But he's nonetheless Mark Anderson is another example, the guy that basically gifted what became Netscape to Jim Clark and became the biggest initial public offering in history in 95. it's not just that Mosaic, the initial browser, was written on a government grant in Urbana, Illinois. It's that Andreessen was the salesman, not the engineer. So the guy that's a wealthy investor married to another member of Silicon Valley royalty, the point, he is not actually the creator, even though he gets to count in Schumpeter's model as the entrepreneur that basically made the whole thing happen. Okay, so innovation's risk justifies unequal wealth. So America has the most unequal distribution of wealth because it's the most innovative society. You can't have one without the other in this model. So when you go back to that chart and you see the US, the percentage of national wealth owned by the 1% going off the chart, the appropriate response in this model is, you know, yay America and yay capitalism, because that's the way it ought to be. And then the last one that's also very important for operating universities and creating teachers is that real innovation basically involves replacing labor with technology, replacing it. So MOOCs that were mentioned earlier, massive open online courses, are an example of Silicon Valley pumping tens of millions of dollars into a terrible idea, if you know anything about teaching, that in other words you can automate it and broadcast it and eliminate the personal connection between the teacher and the student, because everything in their programming is about doing exactly that, about eliminating the human relationship with technology. This is the Industrial Revolution model that we've had since the 18th century, and many people think it's basically run its course. So essentially where this ends up with, if you're coming out of the humanities, you have our experiences both with teaching and with research and with literature and art, et cetera, and with universities. And you look at this, what you see is that it's basically left everything out that's important about our understanding of creativity, that it also has cast them as drags, as drains on capitalism. In other words, it's not just that the English department doesn't make a ton of money, they almost always run in the black. It's not that, it's the opportunity cost problem. If you gave the $150,000 you spend on staff salaries in English to engineering, they would make 10x on the investment, whereas all English is going to do is produce some students. Right? So, I mean, the whole thing becomes very logical if you look at it from their perspective, and also, from my point of view, pretty pernicious. Okay, so humanities as an obstacle and the practices that are attached, that the humanities studies that we exist to study and develop are also, you know, sort of cast out in this way. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on this man. He's pretty interesting, actually. He formulated knowledge management in the 90s when corporate America was starting to worry that everybody was reading Tom Peters and In Search of Excellence and thinking that the empowered employee was the secret to profits, not management and not organization and not finance and not these other things. So what Stewart did in this book that came out in '97 called Intellectual Capital, when he had come from Booz Allen to Fortune, he was an editor there, and then edited Harvard Business Review, is he came up with this handy way of deciding what to do with your employees in a corporation. And essentially what you see is that there are half of, you know, some people are easy to replace and some people are difficult to replace, right? And those come in two categories. There are the easy to replace people who don't add much value, and you basically you use technology to get rid of them. You just use their activities. An annoying version of this is automated phone answering systems, where you don't get an operator, you get a whole bunch of choices and then a mechanical voice. Then there are other options here that I won't go through, but you can basically see what the logic is. The easy to replace high value added people is more complicated. You don't really know what to do, but usually you send them to really highly skilled people in India. That's outsourcing has been the shorthand version of that. There's only one group that you really care about. And these are people who are difficult to replace and they add a lot of value. These are essentially STEM people. They write stuff that you can see has a direct impact on your returns, on your revenues. These other people, it's not so clear. These people, the low value added people, they don't add anything that you really care about, so you want to basically get rid of them, even if they're hard to replace. And these people, again, you're not really so sure about. What universities try to do is with ever increasing desperation, is give students high-end skills that make them difficult to replace. So when they graduate from our universities, they can go into institutions that will value them because they have good skills and they have skills that are hard to replace. The problem is that there's really only a subset of these people for whom that will ever be true in this knowledge management model. So essentially what Stewart did with this was to say, take innovation and sort the sheep from the goats in your own company to be profitable. That is, radically shrink your creative workforce because they cost a lot of money. Keep a piece of your not so creative workforce that you have to keep because you can't find anybody else that can do it as well as you can. And then everybody else, fire them as fast as you can. Outsource them, fire them and then rehire them as contractors. You know, there's a lot of things that you can do. But anyway, this gets kind of established by the mid-90s, and it's a really powerful weapon against the creatives who thought they were the new gold-collar workers. You know, the Generation Ys who were really going to inherit the earth in some deep way and who turned out not to have. And then this very interesting man, Clayton Christensen, who is really the dean of innovation studies in the management world in the United States, who's extremely good. I mean, I think his work is really quite good, and who also was in Korea at one time earlier in his life. The point of this slide is that not only that he was a missionary, but that he's very tall. And he had a breakthrough in the 90s with a book called The Innovator's Dilemma, which then became The Innovator's Solution. And I mean, this is a kind of an amazing thing to say about innovation, which we think is all about genius and about the higher and better thing. The most important innovation is disruptive innovation, which doesn't attempt to bring better products to established customers in existing markets. It doesn't attempt to bring better products. Rather, disruptive innovations disrupt and redefine the trajectory by introducing products and services that are not as good as currently available products. But disruptive technologies offer other benefits. Typically, they are simpler, more convenient, and less expensive products that appeal to new or less demanding customers. Okay, so this is actually an amazing thing that he figured out. I mean, it's kind of under the nose of everybody. And that is that in order to make money in the sort of post-Fordist economy in the United States, you had to not be Xerox, you had to be Canon. You had to not be US Steel, you had to be doing some kind of specialty steel. You had to not be the University of California at Berkeley, you had to be something like BYU Idaho. Okay, so what he's saying is the future of any sector is controlled by the people who are moving down market, not by the smarty pants who are moving up market, and not by the companies that are desperately scrambling to keep an ever higher niche in the business world. It's by the people who go out there and look at all the folks that are working at Walmart and think, you know, they don't have the academic background to do well at, say, you know, Cal State Fullerton. They don't have the money actually even to go to a state school, but they do have enough skill and enough background to do some kind of a hybrid online with some storefront advising that I'm going to set up and charge them $500 for. So you have University of Phoenix that's been doing this for a long time. You have a lot of providers that are doing this, some really badly, some very well. And Christensen is the guy in this book, The Innovative University, that codified it within the framework of this larger understanding that he's had for a long time of where American capitalism has to go. Okay, so the implication of all this stuff is the following. Here's, I think, where we end up with this. The critique, and here, you know, this is the critique. The the innovation model that dominates now, that dominates in business schools, that dominates American common sense, the media, academic managers, pretty much everybody in the society, is that thinking about broad human and cultural factors, as we do in the humanities, restrains, if not actually crushes, innovation. It's simply reminding you about stuff you have to have in there. You have to have some diversity. You have to have some sexuality studies. But you don't really want to spend any more money on it than you have to, because that's not where you're going to be helping your bottom line. And so this is the technogenesis issue also, where what does really help your bottom line is almost entirely technological. And then secondly, that this innovation model blocks every university, every college in the United States' effort to enable broad upskilling for the great majority. And this is Thomas Stewart's contribution. That is, you can spend a lot of money making everybody smart and able, but I can promise you the corporations out there are only going to hire 10% of them at a good wage. And they're going to have to be IP lawyers or something else. They're not going to be just really good BAs with a lot of skills. And this is the, this new global auction era that we're in. And that's Stewart. And then Clay Christensen, without wanting to do this, because I don't believe that this is compatible with his personal ethical framework, nonetheless has designed an understanding of the innovative form of modern capitalism, which sustains a 90-10 polarization, where you basically have a small number, say 10%, working at companies that can move up market, charge global prices, and then 90% that are scrambling to get what will soon count as a good job in one of those moving down market sort of companies, or will not even be in a down market company at all. In other words, where you can imagine a world in which 10 or 15 years being a professor at DeVry or at the University of Phoenix will be a relatively stable and good job compared to the adjuncting that so many people would be doing at, say, publicly badly funded community colleges. All right, so I think where this ends up is that this is stuff that has worked for the United States and for the West for a while, a couple hundred years, worked really well for the United States for 30 or 40 years. It's not working anymore. It's producing both economic flattening out in a global context, and it's producing social dysfunctions on a level that are basically no longer tolerable. Okay, so having spent all of my time on the critique, I'm going to buzz through a couple of things about what I think will actually, we can put in its place. The point we are in the lecture now is, okay, well, so you're so smart and you think that, innovation capitalism a la the brightest minds that have thought about it, Schumpeter, Christensen, et cetera, isn't any good. What would be better? Okay, so just working within the humanities, I mean, there are other discourses that we could draw on. I'm going to propose some things. The first has to do with some work that I've done that I won't dwell on. And the first is to say that actually we not only make money, so that whole stereotype is just bogus and should be contested at every turn, but we actually give money to the STEM disciplines. That where there is it's cheaper to teach our students. We earn more money on teaching than we actually get in our humanities budgets by and large. And we then have it transferred over without actually being asked about this in almost all cases by central administration to other departments. And the evidence for this is almost the only slide that I know of where a university administrator actually produced a visual for some budgeting. And what you see here is that if you look at engineering, this is Arizona State in 2010, you see a loss of $20 million in our money-making operation, that is engineering and life sciences, natural sciences over here. Nursing, law, all lose money. The big money maker, and this is true in every budget that I've ever seen, is the social sciences. Business makes a lot of money because you don't have labs. You're not really doing that much with equipment, even though the salaries are higher. And you'll see also in the positive column at ASU, the Humanities. Because this is, I think, a pretty standard breakdown, and it's an important point to make, but I won't pause on it. Then the second thing has to do with creativity itself. We have innovation as kind of the effect of individual creativity. Innovation is this larger systemic product, but how do you get people, those entrepreneurs, those scientists, those artists, to be creative in the first place? And here I don't think it's possible to avoid going through the traditional understandings of how the university works and what kinds of learning practices happen in them in order to explain where creativity comes from in the first place. This was a traditional mission in the historic university. The founding president of the University of Chicago said in the late 19th century, a career means not learning just skills, but producing people that can develop their own methods of work. I mean, we talked about Dewey, so I won't mention him. My favorite, or read through that, my favorite version of this is the formative president of the University of California, a big Teddy Roosevelt kind of guy, who invented, without wanting to, the academic senate at the University of California by being such an authoritarian tyrant that he forced the faculty to finally respond by organizing. But he says the university proposes to rescue men from slavery and make them free from the bondage of routine. A freeman is a man who can initiate. Each person needs the power to act, to shape, to create. So I mean, he's actually equating routine learning, passive learning, and just having content knowledge, and this is, remember, this is 1900, with bondage. You know, which is quite a strong term in a country like ours that has this massive history of slavery. There's the whole German Bildung precedent, which I will just point to briefly. I don't have time to actually work through this. But I would say that Germany, although it's weird for us to think of, in 1789, when all this thinking about the university is starting to take place in a serious way, sees itself as, if not exactly a frontier nation, at least one that is fragmented and incoherent. It's in the middle of Europe, but it isn't really a country. It doesn't have big cities. It's kind of weirdly poor. It has a really great and effective army, but it kind of is over here in Prussia. It's not really in all these other German states. But the thing that they actually have is a bunch of universities in very coherent towns run by people that have an amazing mission, I mean, a crusade vision of what universities are supposed to do. It's essential, I mean, they see universities as, you know, in sort of the Hegelian Fichtean context, as developing talents in a way that will completely transform society. The ultimate purpose of the university should be the acquisition of the art of using knowledge. Students should cultivate their facility for self-directed learning, enabling them creatively to appropriate and transform knowledge in infinite ways. And then, you know, Fichte, this is something that always, you know, it seems so bitterly ironic to me now. One of the conditions for being a student is being freed from any kind of concern regarding your livelihood. That is, essentially, college has to be free to you, because the thought of not only dividing your time and literally working 1 or 2 work days a week to support yourself, which half of my students do at UC, but having your attention divided and normalized by the work world would destroy your ability to become creative. And here's Schleiermacher's vision, is really to live on the streets like the ancients, to fill them with music and singing like people from the Mediterranean, to feast like the rich as long as money lasts, and then to despise all comforts of life like the ancient cynics, completely to neglect one's clothing or to dress up fashionably. That is academic freedom. I like the emphasis on the clothes as essential to it. It's not clothes, it's total choice, right? It's, in other words, it's creativity as depending radically upon the power of absolute freedom to choose this idea over that idea, etc. And I guess, I mean, the way that I would really summarize this is to say that in the, you know, in this sequence that we have now in the United States of using your reason, having it shaped in college, and then having that support the economy, which then supports society, what the university, all of its best imaginers, has always proposed is actually linking the university directly to the unfolding of the destiny of mankind. That is, that we are central to a social purpose that is simultaneously a spiritual and existential one. That there's no difference between social development and intellectual development as it is manifested there. All right, just a couple of more things here. The Renaissance in the human sciences after World War II, and I use the word Renaissance advisedly, takes all of these novel and interesting and powerful forms that are frightening to many and exhilarating to many others. They connect the university to social movements and to social forces in a way that had not been seen in the United States before. They liberated people from feeling the narrowness of the college, post-college option that they had been sent to college having foremost in mind. They made the society in hostility as well as in supportiveness see the university as directly relevant to society. They made the right wing see the university for the first time as something that had to be contained in a systematic way. And Lewis Powell and many others got involved in building really magnificent institutional networks in order to do that. And it brought a whole new contingent of American society into the university, as you know, fulfilling or promising at least to fulfill the promise of sort of universal higher education really for the first time. So this is a chart from the book that we can essentially ignore except for the pink column on the far end where the university is reinforcing democracy, a kind of a wage or a labor understanding of inventiveness, and the value, you know, that multiracialism, seeing the civil rights movement not as all right, you're right, you know, we were wrong, we have to give you some stuff, but as seeing it as emancipatory for everybody that was part of the society that was being opened up through that movement. There are other examples of this, and I would bring back Christensen this time actually in a positive mode, because although I have concerns about some of the way that he advises people to set up schools on the model of BYU Idaho, and that's something we might want to talk about a little bit in question. What he does understand, and it's something that he has very much in common with Martha Nussbaum, is the transformative personal effects of college and the university as a unique institution, and absolutely unique institution in society. So these are, I think, this would be my list, an initial list of the way that the humanities can be used to essentially help redefine the deep needs of society beyond this narrow understanding of sort of late capitalist innovation that we've been working with so far, that we do subsidies, we have a unique relationship to all of the factors and the complexity of the interaction of the factors that form the self, that we are in the process of building something I haven't talked about at all, which is an actual research infrastructure, and that, and this is really the final thing, that the humanities has practices and understanding that are the elements of an innovation counter theory, something that I hope that we can develop in the next 10 or 20 years. What all this is trying to show is that we have a kind of a Schumpeterian, this is the left column, innovation theory that is no longer functioning effectively in the way that it had before. We have a series of new needs for kind of a global, maybe it's post-capitalism, maybe it's something else, American economy that is just beginning to emerge, and that needs to emerge in a kind of an unrestricted way intellectually. And then we have, interestingly, as a result of the 50-year renaissance that I was talking about, a whole series of insights and understandings about nonlinear innovation that can be connected point by point by point to insights that we and our colleagues around the world in fields that we represent have been developing over these past decades. The rose band ends up with craft agency, which is one that we talked about before with for human formation. individual formation. And I would argue that we have something to say really about each of these things if we had the time and the energy to go through all of them, and the collaborative structure that would allow all of us to sort of work on this project together. So the last thing I want to say is a little bit negative, which is that I don't think that we're quite ready for this. We are still seeing ourselves as, if not actually victimized by this discourse, as marginal to it, as not really having the skills that we need to move into it. We're stuck, I think, too frequently in defensive mode. But for me, that moment of defense is basically is just an opportunity. So this, absolutely the last slide, is I think where we can go from here. The first is the critique, showing the problems that with Schumpeterian innovation as being anti-democratic, wasting of the talents, as Bob talked about, of most of the population, certainly most of the college population, and endangering this middle-class form of society which has been relatively stable and relatively just. And then secondly, re-articulating the deep needs of society, using the existing pieces that we've already developed over the last 50 years to develop a democratic, an egalitarian, an inclusive, a subjectively rich counter model of innovation based on the kinds of things that all of us in this room are already doing. Thanks for your patience. That was
And we have some time for questions and discussion of both papers, both ideas. Anybody have the first question?
It seems to me that what we've got is the forces of the market versus the forces of idealism. And I don't know how you can make, when the forces of the market have a dollar sign in their eyes, how you can make idealism replace that. How you could, to me, because I was raised by a socialist basically, it seems that capitalism is the strategy of a virus, that it's just growth and growth and growth and growth, and ultimately that is going to lead to some kind of suicide. But that is the market as we understand it, and that's what capitalism is supposed to do, is to continue to grow. How do you replace continue to grow as the absolute bedrock of capitalist thinking with the idealism that says growth is ultimately going to, run out of resources or something? You know what I mean? Yes. How do you, to me it seems incommensurate to meet dollar signs with idealism.
That's a great question. I would shift the terms around a little bit, and because I think this is actually practical. I don't think it's idealist. And the reason that I say that is that I say this because market relations are depending on creativity, non-market forces that they misrecognize as already in the market. And they're just wrong about that. They're dependent upon, in some cases because they underpay, parasitically dependent upon basically parenting, teaching, healthcare, all of these sort of non-remunerative practices that go into the formation of people and into the overall society. If you brought the costs that are basically externalized and you brought that into what it costs to have the employees that you have, it would change the economics of it.
Make that, it seems to be almost revolutionary. You would need a revolution. You would need people to say, okay, I'm gonna strike. We're not gonna do this anymore.
Yes, yeah. You need intern strikes. There are adjunct labor movements. Both of these things are happening. We have the environment to make us think much more carefully about sustainability. So that's damaging the growth, infinite growth model, I think, quite a bit. And that may get people to the bargaining table in a way that even other social movements wouldn't. But the thing that I'm really focused on, which may seem abstract at present, is the theory behind it, is that their theory isn't working anymore. The theory misrecognized. What they thought was all entrepreneur is really the ensemble. That if you study Apple engineers, that's a perfect way of sort of refuting the Schumpeterian understanding of all this coming from individuals. So when you begin to see the quality of your society as being in the genius of the group, the genius of the overall community. Yeah, well, yeah, but crowdsourcing not through technology, but through all of the things that Bob was talking about before that we do in this room, that do in classrooms and churches, and all the ways that people come together. Then you figure out ways of sustaining that and paying for it. You don't feel the way that so many Silicon Valley moguls feel, that that's just lost money. That's just money down the drain. If you have a correct innovation theory, our argument would be, you would pay for the whole public correctly and do the development of the entire population. We fought this battle for centuries around lower education, right? And finally, after hundreds of years, people decided that you really need 100% literacy. Like, why does everyone need to read? Was an obvious question in the 18th century. There's literacy, then there's 6 years, then there's 8 years, there's 10 years. Now I think it's just going to have to be 16 years. And the crude argument, the non-idealistic argument for universal 16 years of education, meaning eventually getting to free public university like we have free K to 12, is going to be that your economic model, industry leaders and political leaders, it's not working anymore to have this small elite.
That's a terribly important point. It's broken. It's not working. An odd experience. As a bishop, I did it twice. My job was to try to help people be self-sufficient, and it's not attainable. For a growing percentage of people, it's not a reasonable goal. And so you're sitting there telling somebody, well, why didn't you go to school? Not, well, I did. Well, why didn't you study? Well, I did. So it's in the 80s, I was part of a Marxist study group, and we spent some years together. And one of the funny things was that we'd spend so much time talking about the problem of alienation. And one of the things that's astonishing is how we're able to, and this economic system we're in, how we can internalize all the blame. And I've watched it with my brother-in-law. I'm watching it with a son. The folks you all know who have done everything right and everything's wrong. It's fundamentally broken. And I've had a long interest in evolution and the place of variability. We've put all of our resources in a model that is destructive, and we're at the end, and I couldn't agree more, we're at the end of the viability of that model. The tragedy is that we haven't articulated alternatives, and this is where the humanities ought to be front and center. The first set of problems I see, I used to laugh about the idea of false consciousness. Somehow it's arrogant. I was in a cab in Dayton and talking to a guy who had spent his career with General Motors. And of course, General Motors doesn't hire people anymore. And I asked him, well, with all of this stuff going on, how's that affected you? And he said, I sold my labor. What happens, happens. It's just this profound sense of fatalism, and I'm sensing that. Americans, fatalism? That's unimaginable. It's unsustainable. The religious world has a place to play in this. Mm-hmm. And it is deeply ironic, I think, that and this is where the current Pope gets kind of exciting to me. Mm. We've lost the brother's keeper. And yet I still believe that there is a basis of a deep and abiding goodness in this. We're still a very generous and a remarkable nation. We're becoming less so. But there are resources that can be marshaled, and I think that's part of the plea here. There are counter narratives, counter traditions that are still vibrant, and we've got to tap those. And the humanities has an important place to play in this.
Amen.
I'm interested in the qual-quant binary. And if the legacy of neoliberal theory has been to reinforce it and turn it into a caste system, it's not clear to me, is the counter model trying to break it down, to challenge the actual binary itself? Because when we think about it in our educational lives and our professional lives, most people are not either qual or quant. Even most engineers I know aren't purely quant-minded. Right. And I'm wondering, you mentioned Christensen and Nussbaum are also invested in a notion of self-formation in the university. Would they also challenge that binary? So first of all, is the counter model? It's not clear to me if it's still sort of playing into it, or if that's a key move, is to challenge the.
Yeah, that's a good point. Part of the polemical thrust, the polemical temptation is just to flip them and say qual good, quant bad. And I really don't want to do that, although I can see that I sometimes sound like that. It's, especially because I like quantitative stuff myself. I think there has to be an equality between the two that's set up. In other words, respect for. I guess that really the first move is respect. I mean, it is a little bit of a civil rights kind of language, right, where there needs to be some recognition of the importance of the subordinated element. So it's kind of recognize subordination and then reverse it. After that takes place, then I think richer and more productive discussions can take place about between the two and among these two groups. That's just the way that it is now, where, my first job was at Rice University, where you were an SE, science and engineering major, or you were a flunked out SE major, in which case you went to English or history. And there's quite a bit of that at most universities, especially research universities like mine, where the grants come into STEM and so on. So the first stage has to be really a better understanding of the similarities and the equal status of these disciplines historically and intellectually as the basis for a discussion that has not yet happened.
I'll ask a question, Chris. Thinking about, I find this vision about what can be sort of reimagined in a post-Schumpeterian world really interesting. I think what you say, Bob, about the humanities playing a role in this is really crucial. And I'm thinking about someone like Walter Benjamin, who would look at culture and discern in things that didn't appear revolutionary the trace of what might be. So you see in cinema, not just the content of the movie, but something in the medium itself which bore a different relation to cultural, social practices. And I'm wondering what you make of a current university practice like the digital humanities, which represents kind of a merger between STEM areas and humanities areas, drawing upon their tools, but using our methods in an area which is necessarily collaborative. If you see in that the trace of something like a new model, or whether you see in that kind of thing the co-optation of what might be new in the name of one more iteration of STEM methods.
I don't see it as co-optive, really. I think it's really interesting. I'm not in it so much. I think it poses new challenges for collaboration. So what you can't have are kind of technically inclined humanities people doing the deep dive into programming and spending the first 3 years of graduate school basically being technical assistants to the DH Center, which is a temptation, I think, at a lot of these. So this, it goes back to how you could have parity among the collaborators, where you could design a situation in which the humanities people are coming in with their strengths, you know, with their historical knowledge, with their literary and cultural understandings, and then the science folks are contributing not only technical skills, but, you know, where there's then we're doing a project together. And I don't think that's happened quite as much as it should. And I also know from personal experience in this nano center I mentioned that it's very difficult. It was a bit, in the beginning, scientists wanting the social scientists and humanists to study them in order to produce better PR for their research, which would help the overall funding situation. And they don't want that. They want us to be equals, but then all they could see us wanting to do was studying them, and they were the objects, and they didn't like that. And so that, I think a lot of these collaborations are kind of, they get there, and then they don't progress. And DH, I think, needs to have more sort of theoretical work done on how to really make those collaborations possible.
One of the odd places this is playing out, and I think it's related, the social sciences are in crisis.
Yeah.
And the big issue, as I take it, is what counts as knowledge. And so in 2010, there was a National Research Council subcommittee report on what would count as knowledge in my world, in education. And one of the big conclusions was there needed to be a national data network. And immediately you hear a phrase like that, and what that means is that there'll be certain, like a screen, certain kinds of things will be allowed through and certain other things will be cleaned out. The messy stuff of the humanities, the stuff that anybody who's interested in change immediately recognizes that it's a human problem, it's not a systems problem. And we have right now in the federal government a significant effort to create massive data networks in multiple areas that it's hard to imagine. It's driven by, I dare say this, people some of whom I know, and they're making money off of this for others. But you stop and you think, part of what we're fighting here is a war over what counts as legitimate data and what is knowledge. What is the nature of knowledge? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the humanities can make a compelling case. When you pick up business books like Jim Manzi's book, Uncontrolled, and you open it, here's this numbers guy, and when push comes to shove, he's talking about people trying to figure out problems and trying to make sense out of their world. And when he stands back, he comes to a big conclusion. The systems that we've designed don't work. We have to return to people.
Mm-hmm.
Duh.
As we were walking over to the studio, I passed a student reading a book while walking. And I was saying, what's so fascinating? He's walking while reading. And it was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is still, I think, the #1 best-selling business book in history. And if I'm not mistaken, the #2, it's certainly in the top 3 or 4 best-selling business books in history.
Rumor has it that this building is in part a result of that.
Of the book?
Yeah.
Oh, for a donation. From him. The second is In Search of Excellence, which was a great humanist manifesto around management in the early 80s, the Tom Peters book.
Well, a week ago I read a piece on, there's a funny shift apparently. You would know this, I was stunned, that in Silicon Valley, apparently the clever people aren't there anymore. Of course, they've moved to San Francisco, but what's happened is they're cloning ideas, and the concern is there aren't interesting, unusual ideas being generated. And so there's this kind of crazy feeding frenzy on a carcass that's shrinking.
Mm-hmm.
And the question was, so where do ideas come from?
Yeah.
Where do fresh ideas come from? And incest isn't a good idea.
Mm. Yeah, for apps, for app development especially.
Yeah, it's all apps. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple more questions.
Are there any places in the world that you admire because the humanities are not ghettoized and treated like second-class citizens? Are there any countries in the world whose education systems seem to get it right and foster a greater appreciation of the humanities and not this privileging of the STEM?
Well, you're really going to, this is really stereotyping myself, but France.
Oh, no.
And the other one is Italy, in the sense that they have very stressed university systems. Italy is just crumbling. France has all sorts of problems. But there's cultural training as part of their K through 12 that is inescapable. You know, it's deep, it's rigorous. You learn texts quite well. You go into cafes and you see, you know, 17-year-olds smoking cigarettes, drinking coffee, and holding, you know, Plato in one hand and Montaigne in the other, you know, sort of arguing about how these things go together. We see that here, but less as something that's part of youth and part of development and part of passion and sexuality and, you know, the whole combustible adolescent structure. Italy is still, it does really great work around cultural and artistic history. I mean, the Italian literacy levels are very high. And then I mentioned briefly earlier, I think Asia is moving in this direction in a huge way. So that I was in Singapore to study the Yale National University of Singapore collaboration. And I was really impressed with the intelligence and the breadth of the senior officials that we met with, entirely around this. And the short version of what they all said was sending all of our top testing students into the big four professions worked for Singapore really well for 40 years, and now it's done. Now we got to do something else. And part of what that is the liberal arts. Their biggest, you know, being gay is illegal in Singapore. Their biggest cultural festival is called Pink Dot, which is this totally gay festival that people come to from all over the world and spend absolute piles of money. And when they looked at the spreadsheets, they rethought their position around, you know, inclusion and tolerance, at least de facto, if not de jure. So that society, the dynamism there is quite interesting, and it has liberal arts at the core of it.
There's some of the same things happening in mainland China.
Mm-hmm.
The irony there is that teachers are quite resistant.
Mm-hmm.
They want to stick with the tests, and central government, I'm trying to think if it's in Shanghai or I can't remember the city. They're trying to open up the curriculum and break the test system. But there are strong interests resisting that. It makes for an easy life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, teaching's cake.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's interesting, isn't it, that maybe we'll emulate Singapore in a different way. I don't know. That's a funny thought.